We must understand about this high, thin air is that it does not belong to the ordinary lungs. It is a landscape where the breath itself feels like an inheritance, a borrowed gift from the spirits that the people here believe inhabit every jagged peak and glacial stream. We stand now at the edge of a precipice where the map of the world seems to fray and dissolve into the clouds, looking down upon a kingdom that chose to remain a ghost to the rest of humanity for centuries, not out of fear, but out of a terrifyingly clear sense of self-preservation. It is a land where the thunder is not a weather pattern, but the literal roar of a dragon, and where the silence of the valleys is a deliberate political act. To look at Bhutan is to look at a nation that decided, quite early on, that the soul was more valuable than the machine, and that the internal geography of a human being was the only territory truly worth defending. We find ourselves in a kingdom of roughly 700,000 souls, a tiny demographic tucked between the two most populous giants on Earth. And yet it is Bhutan that feels like the heavy weight in the room, the moral anchor in a sea of frantic progress. We must go back to the 17th century to see the first crystallization of this notion, to a time when a bearded man named Nawang Namgyal fled the northern plateau to find a sanctuary. He was not just a priest or a politician, he was the architect of a psychological fortress. He looked at these vertical jungles and saw more than just granite and pine. He saw a vessel for a specific kind of human existence. He began to build the zongs, those massive whitewashed fortresses that seemed to grow directly out of the mountain stone without the use of a single nail or a formal blueprint. These were not just garrisons, they were the physical manifestation of a dual system where the spiritual and the secular were forced to inhabit the same room, sleeping in the same bed. We walk through the corridors of Punakha Zong even now, and we can feel that ancient pressure, the smell of butter lamps and old wood, the sound of chanting that has not stopped for 400 years, and we realize that this was the moment the notion was born. The idea was simple but radical, that a state exists only to facilitate the enlightenment of its people. If the government cannot provide the conditions for happiness, then the government has no reason to exist. It is an idea that sounds poetic in a textbook, but is agonizingly difficult to maintain when the rest of the world begins to knock at the door with iron and oil. For centuries, we see this kingdom retreating further into its own shadow, while the British Empire was carving up the subcontinent, drawing lines through ancient cultures with the cold indifference of a surveyor's pen. The Bhutanese were moving deeper into the mist. They fought when they had to, using bows made of bamboo and arrows dipped in aconite. But their greatest weapon was their invisibility. We watch as the 20th century dawns elsewhere with the scream of turbines and the smoke of coal. But here, the clocks remain set to the rhythm of the harvest and the prayer wheel. There were no roads, there was no currency, there was only the king, the Druk Gyalpo, and the people who lived in a state of medieval grace. But we cannot remain hidden forever. The world eventually finds a way to bleed through the borders. By the 1960s, the third king looked at the map and realized that if Bhutan did not modernize on its own terms, it would be modernized by the terms of others. This was the great tension, the moment the nation had to decide if it could build a bridge to the future without burning the forest it stood upon. We witnessed the arrival of the first road, a vein of asphalt cut into the mountains by hand, a project that claimed lives and shattered the silence of the valleys forever. We see the first schools, where children who had only ever known the liturgy of the monastery began to learn the languages of the West. It was a period of profound disorientation. Imagine the psychological shock of a farmer who has lived in a world of spirits and seasonal cycles, suddenly being told that he is a citizen of a modern state, that there are things called interest rates and geopolitics. The pressure on the Bhutanese soul was immense. The notion was being tested. Could they take the tools of the modern world, the medicine, the engineering, the connectivity, without taking the poison that usually came with it? This is where the fourth king, a young man who ascended the throne at 18, made a declaration that sounded like madness to the economists of the 1970s. He said that gross national happiness was more important than gross national product. We shouldn't mistake this for a whimsical or new age sentiment. It was a cold, calculated survival strategy. It was a rejection of the idea that a human being is merely a unit of production. As we track this philosophy through the closing decades of the century, we see it manifest in ways that are both beautiful and startlingly rigid. We see a nation that bans plastic bags decades before it is fashionable in the West. We see a kingdom that declares by law that 60% of its land must remain under forest cover for all time, choosing the breadth of the trees over the wealth of the timber industry. We see the total ban on tobacco, the refusal to allow mass tourism to trample the sacred sites, and the odd, striking absence of a single traffic light in the capital city of Thimphu. But we also see the cost of this purity. To maintain a soul, a nation often has to be exclusive. We see the friction of those who did not fit the notion, the painful ruptures within the population, and the hard, sometimes cruel decisions to protect a singular cultural identity. History is never a clean upward climb. It is a series of trade-offs, and in Bhutan, the trade-off for a preserved paradise was a level of social control that would make a liberal Democrat tremble.
Then comes the most extraordinary pivot in the history of any monarchy. We reach the year 2008, a year that should have been the height of absolute power for the fifth king. Instead, we see him doing something almost unheard of in the annals of human power. He orders his people to be free. He travels to the most remote villages, walking for days over mountain passes, to convince a reluctant, terrified populace that they must accept democracy. The people wept. They did not want to vote. They wanted their king. They saw the chaos of the world outside, the bickering of parties and the corruption of the ballot box, and they begged to remain subjects. But the king insisted. He understood that the notion could no longer be held by one man. It had to be woven into the fabric of the people themselves if it was to survive the coming century. We see the first elections conducted with a mixture of reverence and confusion as monks and yak herders stood in line to decide the fate of their nation. It was a revolution from the top down, a king stripping himself of his own crown to save the kingdom from the eventual decay that haunts all autocracies. Today, we stand in a Bhutan that is the only carbon-negative country on Earth, a place where the forests actually drink the sins of the rest of the world's industry. We see a younger generation with smartphones and Western clothes, walking through streets where the buildings are still required by law to be painted with traditional motifs. The tension has not vanished. It has only changed shape. The world is no longer knocking at the door. It is inside the house, through the glowing screens in every pocket. The notion is now facing its greatest trial. Can a culture built on the rejection of desire survive in an age of infinite digital craving? We see the struggle in the eyes of the youth in Thimphu, torn between the ancient peace of their grandfathers and the frantic energy of a globalized world. We see a nation that has successfully guarded its borders, but is now realizing that the most dangerous invasion is the one that happens silently through the mind. We look back at this long journey from the first Dzong to the first democratic parliament, and we are forced to ask ourselves a difficult question. We see a people who have sacrificed wealth for well-being and speed for soul, and we wonder if they have found a secret we have forgotten, or if they are simply holding their breath in a room that is slowly running out of air.
If a nation succeeds in becoming a sanctuary, but in doing so becomes a museum, has it truly survived? We leave this kingdom of clouds and thunder, wondering if the happiness they have so carefully guarded is a gift for the future, or a beautiful fading relic of a world that no longer knows how to be still. As the shadow of the Himalayas stretches across the valley, we must ask, in our own frantic pursuit of everything, what is the one thing we have lost that these people were willing to die to keep?